Having started in 1949, now being 76 years old, MotoGP is the world's oldest motorsports world championship. That is a lot of history. And if you're a newer fan of the sport or diving into its history for the first time, it can be a lot. There aren't really many videos out there that aren't AI trash that provide a succinct history of the events that led to the worldwide phenomenon that is MotoGP today. If that's what you're after, look no further, because my name is B, this is the Beehive Paddock, and today we're looking at a very brief history of MotoGP. I'm going to try and keep this video brief, so I'm going to be glossing over many of the finer details of the history, but hopefully this will spark your interest and give you some more things to further your research. And let's start not at the beginning, but a while before it. Around the turn of the 20th century, the concept of auto racing was beginning to grow popular among both daredevils and manufacturers looking to prove mechanical superiority over their rivals. Naturally, this extended to two-wheeled machinery as well, and in 1904 the first international motorcycle race was held, the Paris Coup International de Motocyclettes. I apologize to my French viewers. This race was contested by teams from 5 countries. France won, but multiple countries cheated and then got mad at each other for cheating, and they decided to form an organization to make sure nothing shady ever happened in the world of racing again. The International Federation of Motorcycling Clubs, or FICM. They lasted 2 years. Luckily, they reformed in 1912, and by 1924, multiple major motorcycle road races had begun to appear across Europe, attracting international attention. And thus, the FICM European Grand Prix Championship had its inaugural season in 1924. And this series would continue until a certain mustache-faced German man would decide to ruin the fun in 1939. Fortunately, he was dealt with. And after a few years of recovery, the FICM dropped a letter from its name and decided to revive the European Championship as a World Championship. And in 1949, the Grand Prix Motorcycle Racing World Championship was officially born. They would not hold a race outside of Europe until 1961. The Grand Prix Motorcycle Racing World Championship consisted of 5 classes: sidecars, the 125cc class, the 250cc class, the 350cc class, and the premier 500cc class. The European Championship had already raced all these classes at different points in time. The pre-war era had seen most of its races dominated by British machinery, and in the beginning this was true of the World Championship as well, with Leslie Graham winning the inaugural 500cc championship on an AJS Porcupine. Although Italian manufacturers like Moto Guzzi, Marini, and Mondial were beginning to make their mark in the lower classes. In contrast to the Grand Prix of today, the original Grand Prix calendar only consisted of 6 rounds. But these races were also much longer than those of today, with it not being too uncommon for races to run for longer than 2 hours. These early races were mostly run on street circuits as well, the most famous of which is the Isle of Man TT, often lauded as the most dangerous motorsports race in the world, and a staple of the early World Championship. The very early days of the championship were a battle between 2 countries, Britain, who had dominated the pre-war era with their single-cylinder beasts, and Italy, producing cutting-edge multi-cylinder machinery. Major British manufacturers included Norton, Velocet, and AJS, while Italy was represented by Gilera, Moto Guzzi, and MV Agusta, all of whom fielded factory teams at one time or another, usually in multiple classes. But not all riders were factory-backed. Most were privateers. Riders who bought their own bikes, serviced them all on their own, and drove from race to race for the love of the sport, living off the meager start money that race organizers hated to give out, and dotting the fields around race circuits with tents and van. In the war between factories, though, it was only once the British and Italians combined their efforts that the best results could truly be seen, as British riders Jeff Duke and John Surtees would become the sport's first major superstars, riding for Italian brands Gilera and MV Agusta respectively. It was MV that would go on to have the biggest impact though. By 1957, the British bikes weren't really competitive most of the time, and the Italian consumer market was trending towards cars, so many factories stopped sending official teams. MV's team wasn't really for the purpose of developing bikes though, rather it was the hobby of Count Augusta, and so they remained, and began to torch everyone in their path. They took every solo class title for 3 years straight between 1958 and 1960. In 1959, a Japanese company called Honda entered their bikes in the championship for the first time, and just 2 years later, they won the 125 and 250 world titles. The rider who won the 250 title for them was Mike Halewood, who would go on to have one of the most successful careers ever, eventually becoming a 9-time world champion across 3 classes. It was quite common at the time for riders to race in multiple classes in the same year for a single factory, with Hailwood at one time being asked to participate as a full-time rider in 3 separate classes for Honda. Soon, Honda was joined by other Japanese manufacturers. Yamaha, Kawasaki, and Suzuki all had titles in the lightweight and middleweight classes to their name by the end of the 1960s. Meanwhile, in the premier class of 500s, the championship experienced its greatest battle yet: Hailwood versus Agostini. In 1965, Mike Hailwood was riding for MV in the 500s, chasing his 4th consecutive Premier Class title and MV's 8th. He was joined by a young Giacomo Agostini out of Italy, who would be Hailwood's closest competitor and greatest rival. When Hailwood left for Honda in 1966, the two would spend 2 years battling in legendary championships, with the 1967 championship actually ending in a tie, with Agostini eventually winning on account back of their best results. And then, the Japanese manufacturers left. What? Why? Well, to find out, let's rewind a bit and talk about the 1961 125cc championship. Something very interesting was happening that year. A little bike from a small workshop in East Germany was beating some of the most well-funded factory efforts on the planet. Ernst Degner and his MZ were the first bikes to ever make use of an expansion chamber to really get that 2-stroke power. Finally, the theoretically more powerful 2-strokes were actually able to live up to their potential, and MZ would lead the charge into a 2-stroke future, is what many people thought, until Degner made a deal with Suzuki to give them all of the knowledge necessary to copy MZ in exchange for smuggling him and his family out of communist-occupied East Germany, which they did, and Degner, aboard a Suzuki, immediately won the brand new 50cc World Championship in its first season using the stolen tech. And so the 2-strokes screamed their way through the smaller classes in the 60s, replacing the 4-strokes entirely. But these bikes with their copious cylinders and up to 14 gears stayed out of the larger classes for the time being. And in an effort to avoid smaller factories being priced out by the copious cylinders and gears I just mentioned, the FIM placed hard limits on both for the 1968 season. Upset by this, Honda and Suzuki walked, leaving MV to dominate yet again. MV was yet again the only major factory effort. There were some minor factory efforts during this time, but even then they were severely underfunded and not nearly the operations of any that had come before or since. Agostini would dominate with MV, winning 13 championships across the 500 and 350 classes before he moved to Yamaha for 1974. Japanese manufacturers began to trickle back during the 1970s, now focused on the larger classes as well, and 2-stroke technology had matured enough to change the status quo even in the 500s. Australian rider Jack Finlay won the first 500cc race on a 2-stroke in 1971 aboard a Suzuki, and just 4 years later in 1975, Giacomo Agostini would become the first world champion on a 500cc 2-stroke with Yamaha. The changing from 4-strokes to 2-strokes happened fast, and just a single year after the first 2-stroke championship, Agostini himself would secure the final ever 4-stroke 500cc win in 1976. 76 was also the last year of the Isle of Man TT on the World Championship calendar. The event was consistently responsible for the deaths of beloved and talented riders year after year, and many top riders had begun to boycott it, believing riders who wanted to compete in the World Championship shouldn't have to participate in a race so dangerous. They succeeded, and this was the beginning of a change for Grand Prix racing. Riders like 2-time British champion Barry Sheene and 3-time American champion Kenny Roberts were advocates for riders in the 70s and 80s, lobbying for increased pay and better safety measures, as well as giving riders more power over race organizers. The sport was growing, and the bikes were getting more and more powerful each year, so the safety standards rightfully had to grow with them. The raw power of the 500cc 2-strokes had also begun to outpace the chassis and tire technology of the day, and by the 1980s, the bikes were wild machines that were very difficult to keep in line. This lended itself perfectly to the dirt track experienced Americans and Australians, who would dominate the 80s and 90s with their wild riding styles. Full races were also regularly being broadcast on TV now, and major sponsors were being attracted. Kenny Roberts, Freddie Spencer, Barry Sheene, Wayne Gardner, Eddie Lawson, Wayne Rainey, Kevin Schwantz, and Mick Doohan were some of the first personalities to make a name for themselves on TV sets instead of in the magazines. And their battles with each other and the incredible bikes themselves are remembered by many as some of the best ever. Additionally, the series was streamlined during the 80s, with the 350cc bikes being dropped and the 50cc bikes briefly becoming 80cc bikes before being dropped as well. The practice of riders riding in multiple classes in a season mostly stopped as well. With calendars getting longer and the level of racing getting more and more demanding, it simply wasn't feasible, and many began to look at the classes less as individual events and more as stepping stones towards the premier class. The era of the unridables concluded with the dominance of Mick Doohan, who took 5 consecutive titles between 1994 and 1998 for Honda, who had established themselves as the most dominant constructor of all time, with probably the best bike to that point, the NSR 500. Two-strokes weren't the way of the future on the road, and the four-stroke superbike formula was becoming more popular. So the championship adapted, and in 2002, 500cc two-strokes would be racing along 990cc four-strokes, with the final 500cc championship being won by a young Italian named Valentino Rossi. This new 990cc four-stroke formula was also given a flashy new name: MotoGP. The four-strokes easily won the battle of the bikes in 2002, and the new formula even attracted manufacturers who had been shying away prior, including Kawasaki and Ducati. In 2003, the final 500cc two-stroke would start at the Czech Republic, and the second era of four-strokes was officially on. It was the aforementioned Valentino Rossi who would dominate the early MotoGP era, winning with Honda and Yamaha and not relinquishing a title until 2006, when American Nicky Hayden took it. The series also saw a shift back towards being dominated by European riders. Italy was still a major force, but Spain was now beginning to make itself known as a hotbed of road racing talent. Hayden would be the last American world champion, and Australian phenom Casey Stoner would be the last Premier Class non-European champion to date, winning in 2007 and 2011. In 2008, two eras began in MotoGP simultaneously. The first was the shift to 800cc machines in an effort to lower costs during the global recession and slow down the riding just a bit. Additionally, in 2009, Bridgestone became the sole tire supplier for the series, meaning every bike now had to run Bridgestone tires exclusively. These bikes are nearly universally panned by MotoGP fans for producing boring racing, although funnily enough, some of the most iconic battles ever also came during this time. And this is because of the talent. The late 2000s and early 2010s is sometimes called the Alien Era as well, and this is due to a group of riders commonly known as the Alien Quartet, comprised of Casey Stoner, Valentino Rossi, Dani Pedrosa, and Jorge Lorenzo, with the four of them winning all but 3 races across a 6-season span between 2007 and 2012, with Rossi, Stoner, and Lorenzo each taking championships during that span of time, and all 4 being in the top 10 of all time for Premier Class wins. Despite the Premier Class going 4-stroke nearly a decade ago, the 125cc and 250cc two-stroke classes persisted. That is, until they didn't. In 2010, the 250s became Moto 2, and in 2012, the 125s became Moto 3. And now the grid was fully 4-stroke based, with Moto 2 using CBR 600R engines and Moto 3 using Prototype 250 engines. Additionally, MotoGP moved up to a full leader formula in 2012, and a new talent would emerge: Marc Marquez, who became the first rookie since Kenny Roberts in 1978 to win the Premier Class World Championship in his rookie season, and he would proceed to repeat the championship in 2014 as well. 2015 is a long story, but to cut it very short, Marc Marquez and Valentino Rossi got into a feud with each other. And this feud has persisted for so long now that it still shapes the way that MotoGP discourse happens online, with Rossi and Marquez fans taking every opportunity to harass each other on any website that allows you to type. Moving on to better things in 2016, MotoGP switched to a homologated ECU, which meant every team now used the same software, and Michelin replaced Bridgestone as the sole tire supplier for the series. From 2016 to 2019, Marc Marquez and Honda continued to add to their resumes, with Honda now boasting every manufacturer record under the sun, and Marc thoroughly establishing himself as one of the best ever. When Marc crashed hard in 2020 and injured himself for the season, Honda's weaknesses began to show, and it became clear that Ducati, with their advancements in aerodynamics and electronics, had become the dominant force, and that gap would only continue to grow. In 2025, when this video is being made, Ducati have been virtually unbeatable for a number of years. Interestingly enough, this is the first time since the 1960s that European bikes seem to have an advantage over Japanese bikes in the Premier Class. And it seems it will stay that way until the end of the 1000cc era, which will come in 2027, with many new specifications including downsizing to an 850cc engine, banning much of the aerodynamics that make racing boring in the eyes of many fans today, a brand new tire supplier in Pirelli, and a switch to 100% sustainable fuel. And there you have it, from 1949 to today, a very, very brief introduction to the history of MotoGP. Again, this video is not meant to serve as being comprehensive in any way. There's so much more to learn. And to do that, I highly recommend getting books. I know, reading in the big 2025 or whatever. But seriously, authors like Michael Scott, Kevin Cameron, Dennis Noyes, Matt Oxley, these are the actual heroes of MotoGP journalism who make it possible for younger fans like me to learn about the very, very fascinating history of MotoGP. And you should absolutely go check it out. I can't recommend their work enough. And that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for watching, and a special thank you to my channel members. MVP 2112, Venturian CRO, Sean, Motosapien, B, Jack the World's Fastest Maori, Drew Gibbs, Really Very Bored 1, Carl Ruppersberg, Schmaluten, Troy the Boy, Moneypenny, ASX91, Luis Campos, and Ian Ellison. And to everyone, have a fantastic day.